Welcome to the PetroPapers podcast. Say that 10 times fast. This is where you get your oil and gas intellectual stimulation by asking the technical questions. I'm Yogashri Pradhan, and with me here today, I have Liz Dennett. Today, instead of talking about papers, we're going to go over people in this season, in which we explore their career paths, hear about their advice on how to make technical contributions to the industry, and listen to their tips. Welcome to the podcast, Liz.
I am so excited to be here. I also may geek out about some technical details, so spoiler alert.
No worries. This is a technical detail safe zone.
Oh, love it.
Well, I wanted to kick it off by asking you, how did you get here? Tell me about your career path.
Oh man, so that is actually a very funny question. I would love to joke and be like, it's been a meandering journey that's been very well plotted out since I was a young child. No. Growing up, I wanted to be the pink Power Ranger. Then I wanted to be a fashion designer. And these days, I'm the CTO of Synvita, which is a startup that uses biosolutions to positively impact the energy transition. And as of about a fortnight ago, I am the CEO of one of our subsidiaries, Endolith. And our mission there is to use microbes to provide the critical minerals needed for the energy transition, which is really cool. But even hearing myself say CEO, I have to catch myself because I'm a technologist by background. Like I have a master's and PhD in astrobiology. I'm wearing a DNA dress right now. Like technology is just part of my DNA, pun intended. And so to have a job title that says CEO is so bizarre to me. It is never anything I ever imagined, which just puts a whole new dimension on how I ended up here because I'm not just doing really cool tech in the energy transition space. I'm actually leading a company that is looking at how we can get more copper and more lithium, which are some of these really important minerals that are needed to accelerate the energy transition and to do it in a way that's just and favorable for all people around the world. And that is a very interesting space to be in. To take a step back, I got a master's and PhD at Wisconsin-Madison in astrobiology, where I worked for NASA looking at how life evolved on early Earth, specifically looking at banded iron formations and pyrite oxidation, which is what we're using in mining now with endolith. So that's been a very weird full circle moment. After that, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I come from a very rural town in Alaska where none of my parents had fancy office jobs. And I ended up interning for an oil and gas company kind of on a whim, didn't really know what I was going to do. And I loved it because I found that I could have more of an impact on things like saving water than I could just doing science on the outside. So I went and I worked at Hess Corporation for a few years. Um, it was the absolute best place to start my career. I got to work onshore and offshore. I did an exploration rotation with some incredible mentors. And at the time, we had some new exploration assets. This is a quick aside. So we had these new exploration assets, and as an early career individual, I was doing wherever they needed me to do. And so I worked up all these prospects and matured prospects on this brand new 3D seismic we were getting in. And if listeners have ever worked on brand new 3D seismic, we had no well control in the area. We had some very old 2D seismic, and we were drilling pretty much our first well in the area, our first or second well. We had no idea. And I kept looking at this and trying to figure out the AVO and looking at these bright spots in the seismic and being like, well, I don't really know what I'm doing here, but there could be a lot of oil here, or we're just really poorly calibrated and the seismic is incredibly off. And so the estimates I was working up were massive. And my management team was like, okay, and I wasn't an intern, I was early career, but they were like, these are huge. What is going on? And we looked at it and we're like, okay, this is either a lot of oil or something's really funky with our seismic. The place I was working was Guyana, and the first well we were drilling was the Liza 1 appraisal well. So it turns out all the bright spots I was seeing were actually just like sands of single digit Darcy porosity and super high permeability. And it was incredible. So that really spoiled me in terms of where I could be a geologist. I like to think that after that, I was like, well, oil and gas geology, there's nowhere to go but down. So I found myself a few years later living in San Diego, working in a biotech company, pioneering genomics in the energy space. It was like a mini MBA. I was drinking out of a fire hose, trying to figure out how to scale up a subsurface DNA lab. And then after being there for a few years, joined the team at AWS, Amazon Web Services, learned all about solution architecture, cloud workloads. I was there for a few years before joining the team at Wood Mackenzie to lead data architecture and data engineering, and spent a lot of time in Scotland, which was incredible. Built a team pretty much from the ground up to do some really exciting things around energy data platforms and how data came into the system, took some huge career leaps there, and then decided to take an even bigger career leap and join the team at Synvita as their chief technology officer about 4 months ago.
That is amazing.
So, and my parents are still up in Alaska. I still go back up and see them in Alaska. They could not describe what I do. And in fact, I was up there just a few weeks ago and I was at the grocery store getting a donut because there's this grocery store chain where we used to go as kids to get donuts on special occasions. And I was stopped by a guy who told me that if I ever wanted to get a real job, I'd have to change my purple hair. I have bright purple hair that I've had for the past year. And so that, I think, summarizes kind of the dichotomy of where I came from and where I am now. Is going back to my hometown in my late 30s, I get stopped and told I'll have to dye my hair if I ever want to amount to anything. And yet I've had this incredibly robust journey. I've had incredible mentors that have taken huge leaps of faith at me, and I've done some pretty cool things.
That sounds like an amazing, amazing career path, and I'm so glad I asked that question. To dive into some of that,
Where do you even start with
trying to
that?
even figure out where to even start to unpack this. But I did have the question about what have been some of those inflection points, like specific inflection points for you when pursuing technical growth?
Yeah. So I have a very early memory. I had this incredible woman that was leading the early career development program at Hess when I was there. And I came out as a freshly minted PhD, and I went straight through master's, PhD. No one in my direct family had gone to grad school. And so I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I figured I'd just go through college while they kept paying and while it was cool. And they didn't kick me out. I ended up publishing some really cool papers. And I came out as like a 26, 27-year-old freshly minted PhD with the, I think it's fair to say now, the social skills of a 26-year-old freshly minted PhD. And I had this wonderful mentor, Lori Green, who very candidly sat me down and said something along the lines of like, Liz, the technology pieces for you will probably come easy, but it's going to be the interpersonal pieces that are going to be challenging. And I remember looking at her and being like, in my head thinking, but people are like technology. It's just as cool. Like you're just, how could there be a disconnect between the technology and the interpersonal pieces? It's both the same thing. If I'm really good at science, I will therefore be really good at managing a career and moving up in a business. And I'd always wanted to be a manager and a leader of teams. And so I assumed that the skill sets would translate to either of them. Spoiler alert, they do not whatsoever. And the technical growth points have actually been so much more straightforward than having to manage and learn to be a really empathetic and effective people manager and people leader. But to answer your question, a lot of the technology scaling points are moments where I find myself looking around going, well, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And there's some perverse joy that I get in that. When I started grad school, I drove this little tiny red car from my hometown in Alaska down to Wisconsin-Madison. And I had gotten in, I was on a full ride making, like $18,000 a year, more money than I'd ever seen in my entire life. And I remember orientation very well because I was sitting around a table with about 12 or 13 other first year grad students. We were both master students and some had already had their masters. And I had this was in the mid 2000s. I had this MacBook Pro that was like duct taped together, but the silver of the duct tape worked with the silver of the MacBook Pro. And we were going around the room talking about ourselves and what our parents did. And my dad was fixing hot tubs up in Alaska, and my mom was running a shop. My dad was a geologist, though, before he retired to take care of me and my brother and to be a stay-at-home dad when we were in middle school. So like he is a scientist by background. But everyone else is like, yeah, my parents are professors. My parents are lawyers. I went to Harvard. I went to Stanford. I went to this small school that I've never heard of. I've published these papers. And I remember sitting there being like, well, I have about $80 in my bank account and my laptop is literally falling apart. And I'm pretty sure that I came from a very different world than the rest of the people around me. And I had a little absolute freak out and then was like, okay, what do I have going for me? Well, I can't fix anything revolving relating to socioeconomic class. I can't fix my college experience. And this is a lot of imposter syndrome here in hindsight. Like I had done undergraduate research. I had great letters of recommendation. I had a lot of things going for me, but at the time it didn't feel that way. So I had one of those, I guess it would be like a movie montage moments, like splashing water on your face. What do I do now? And I remember kind of taking stock and being like, well, I'm from small town in Alaska and I can work really effing hard. Like I can work hard. That's one thing I can do. And so I told myself at that point that I was just going to work harder than everyone else I saw. If they were reading one paper a day, I would read two. If they were getting into the lab at 8 a.m., I would get to the lab at 7 a.m. If they were putting together whatever hours of homework, I would do that plus 10%. I was just going to work as hard as I could. And then doing that, I was like, well, Liz, if you're going to be a scientist, you can't actually benchmark hard work against other people. You need to figure out your own internal barometers. And so I worked my ass off. And that was the one thing I had going for me. I ended up having a pretty successful graduate career. And to this day, though, whenever I see that kind of challenge and whenever I'm in a place that I don't know how I'm going to get through, that kind of hard work montage kicks in. And there's a perverse part of me that loves it. I have a flyer on that side. My team's motto for the quarter is inventing our way out. Because the problems we're facing in terms of the energy transition where we are, they don't have easy answers. We need to invent our way out. And the only way to do that is through hard work and creativity. And so when I look at these technology inflection points, I think about all the moments I've been up. I'm an early morning person. So like I'm up at 4 a.m. because I can't sleep and I am reading scientific papers. I am whiteboarding out my mental model of how something looks, or I'm setting up meetings with people just to sit down and whiteboard with me and say, does this make sense? How would you think about this? And honestly, those are some of the happiest moments of my life because I'm pushing the boundaries of how I understand things. And there's something so pure about that.
That's awesome.
It's a very
I mean,
long-winded answer.
I would say I'm an early riser myself. I wake up at 4:30, so I sleep in a little bit more than you do.
I mean, it ebbs and flows. Today, I slept in until like 7:30 because I was up late because we had a lot of meetings yesterday. But I love the promise of a new day and like the
Of
quiet
course.
time. And there's something rebellious about being like, no one else is here. This is my time.
Yes, I completely agree with you on that. But I'm usually working out in the morning instead of reading papers. But I do read papers just later in the day.
That's fair. It's fair.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about your current job at Synvita. What is exactly Synvita and what does it do?
Oh, Synvita is probably one of the coolest companies that I've ever even seen or heard of, and I've been following them for a long time. So they do biosolutions for the energy transition. What that sounds very esoteric, but what it means is I'll hold up a little logo for you to see it. Um, we're essentially three or four companies in one. We are three companies and a biosolutions innovation center in one. And we look to nature and we look to microbes to figure out how we can solve some of these pressing energy challenges. So at its core, at the hub, we have the biosolutions group, which is awesome, innovative things like a bioprospecting center. We have Indiana Jones style microbe hunters that go out into nature, get microbes, and then we domesticate them so that we're able to use existing metabolic pathways. We then have what we could consider domestication tools like adaptive laboratory evolution, so we can take the endogenous capabilities of the microbes and get them to do unique things. Like, hey, you can oxidize this carbon compound or this sulfur compound. Can we do it in really salty water? Because there's not that much fresh water and that could be a limiting resource. Let's do it with different high salinity compounds. We also have tools like genetic engineering we can use. And then you have to go from those little bioreactors that are teeny tiny, like a few mils, all the way up to 10,000 liter bioreactors. And we have the engineering expertise to do that. And then in parallel, we have genomics and laboratory analytics and a cloud-first technology stack that enables all of the innovation to happen. So that's kind of the hub that keeps everything going, or the flywheel. The three companies we have utilizing that are one that's called Gold Hydrogen, where we take existing oil and gas wells and use microbes to produce hydrogen in situ. And we are just working on, we've done some field deployments and proof of concept. And then we have Eco2, which is essentially a factory to take CO2 and make some type of compound out of it, whether it's things like sustainable aviation fuel, where we have some pretty high profile partnerships, or other compounds, we can manufacture those. And then we have Endolith, or the biomining one, which I'm overseeing these days, where we take microbes and we take low-grade ore for copper and lithium, and we set those teeny tiny little microbes to work, having a huge impact to get more copper or more lithium out of it so that we can fuel the energy transition.
That's amazing. I would love to ask about if there's any white papers or if there's any research that's been done, that's been published, whether if it's through your company or whether if it's through other companies. Feel free to share them with me, and
Yeah.
I could share them with the listeners as well.
Yep. A great place to start is our Endolith LinkedIn page. We actually just launched that a week ago. And today for our post, we're going to say, Endolith, the company, whoever is behind the social media is going to be like, explain what you're doing to me like I'm 5. That whole explain it like I'm a small human bit. We do have some, the website is a great place to check out. We also have a lot of top tier press releases. So you can see what our customers are saying and how they're planning to leverage the technology as well.
Perfect.
It's
Now,
always
go
interesting
ahead.
being on the commercial side too, because having been in industry and at the startups and then in academia too, there's so much cool stuff going on behind the scenes, and so much of it you have to keep really close to the chest, to your chest or the chest of the company. So if you're ever out there, spoiler alert, and there's a cool startup that you love and they haven't published a lot, see if you can join as an advisor and sign an NDA. And a lot of times they will bring you in, you can see the science, you can get to know what they're doing and help contribute. And it's a way to help fuel the next generation of startups. That's a cool trick for the listeners.
Great. Maybe I might take some of that, take a page out of that too.
You absolutely should. It's something that I don't think people necessarily realize, but there's a lot of like stealth mode or early stage startups that just are keeping things under trade secrets, so they're not publishing them. And there's only so far you can get. But if you are curious to learn more, or spoiler alert, if you're curious to what we're doing at Synvita and wanna learn more, come hit me up.
For
Slide
sure.
into my DMs on LinkedIn.
For sure. So what is some advice you can give to our listeners on making technical contributions to the industry?
The first big one I would say is to be a technical leader. So I'm going to approach this from the space of a technical leader. I've been an individual contributor, but I found that I can have the most power and the most impact as a leader, whether it's a tech leader, a leader of a few people, or the leader of a large organization. The mental model I have for that is to be kind of like a duck, to be kind of calm on the surface, but to have your legs paddling as hectically as you can be underneath the surface. And by that, I mean, know your tech, know what you're doing, know it inside and out. If you're in the tech space or you're curious about it, that actually will come pretty easy to you. You'll probably know more about your technology than anyone else in the room, in any room you are in. But it's not enough just to know it. And in fact, if you know it that well, it can many times be a disservice because you start to go in the weeds, or you start to shift every conversation into the deep technical nuances. So that's where the upper part of the duck comes in, the calm, confident one. And in terms of that, communicating not just what the technology is, but what you think needs to happen is very important. A great trick I have for that is when you're in a meeting, let's say it's a staff meeting or a team meeting, and you have some ideas. If you are trying to portray yourself as a leader or more confident, I've most of my life have been the youngest person in the room, the one that people aren't quite sure about. Purple hair, granted, doesn't help my case, or I'm trying to earn trust with a new team. A tip I have is I'll write down in my notebook or on a piece of paper what my 3 takeaway messages are, or what I want to happen, is very succinct sentences. My writing skills tend to be very strong, and I cut out the filler words. When I'm talking, especially if it's a casual conversation like this one, I'll meander a little bit more. You'll hear my upward inflection come out. I'll use sometimes more of a vocal fry. And I try not to use that in business settings. Not because I don't love those things. They're very, very core and germane to who I am as an elder millennial, but because there are studies that perceive that to go with less competence in leaders. And so it's nothing to do with how I talk or communicate. And I will never give anyone feedback about their native mannerisms. If someone on my team is loud and enthusiastic, I love that. I'm never going to tell them to use their inside voice. Like, I think we need to harness that. But in certain meetings, I want to present myself in a way that's easier to digest for my audience. Just like if I'm giving a talk, I'll practice it so that the audience can have a lower bar to understand it. So I'll write down my 3 points using the most succinct vocabulary I can. I'll sit up very straight. I'll take a nice deep breath. I'll channel the persona that I want to give, and I will say those 3 points. I won't say, any questions? Does that make sense? I will just say, we have a key risk with the deliverable of number 2. We need to be mindful of this outcome. Moving forward, we need to loop in this project manager. Period. My 2 or 3 points, I've made them, and that to me has a lot of impact because you've said what you've wanted to say, you haven't diluted it, and it's also established yourself as a confident and competent person in the room. If left to my own devices, sometimes I would say things like, you guys, this technology is really cool, but we have massive issues in this part of it. Have we thought about these 17 things? Sometimes you can do that, but in a lot of meetings, especially if you're early or new or wanting to build that technical credibility, saying less is saying more. You can have the more casual conversations one-on-one in a meeting room or in your office.
I love that nuance. I love the fact that you said that saying less is saying more. I really
And
do.
that's not to say that you have to fit into a certain box or a certain mold. I hope even here, just saying, those are things that let me process and let me talk as I'm going. And that is key to how I like to operate. If you are coming into the industry and wanting to establish yourself as a technical expert, when I was coming in, there was very much a box that you had to fit in. It was the dominant paradigm at the time, which in many ways was white middle-aged men. And if you wanted to be the technical expert, those were the individuals that had been in oil and gas companies for 30 plus years, and they were the ones that were seen as experts. And I was strongly encouraged to look and talk and act like that. I have seen a lot of movement away from that, and working in spaces like the tech sector and in startups, I've also had the power to actively cultivate and grow teams where that is not the case. My team now is like 65% female. Within Synvita, we have over 20 countries represented. So we are not just Americans by default. We are Americans in that we're a melting pot of many nationalities and many ideas, but it's a very diverse place. And I think there's a lot of power with that, but it's also important to know what your end goal is.
Definitely. Well, there's one more question I wanted to ask you before I let you go. And that one question is, what motivates you to solve oil and gas problems? I know it's mostly in the energy transition space, but what motivates you to solve the oil and gas problems?
Oh, they're all so interrelated. As someone that uses oil and gas all the time, this is the problems that we're trying to solve, we as citizens on the planet right now, are hard. They're incredibly hard problems. I am not egotistical enough to think that solving a tiny piece of this will be my legacy on the planet. But I like to hope that having a positive impact on the people around me and the science will hopefully be a part of the legacy. But to me, it really is the challenge that our generation is facing. We need to ensure that subsequent generations are able to get access to power, not necessarily to have internal combustion engine cars, because that in many ways is a very myopic way of thinking about it. When I think about the role of hydrocarbons, I think about the energy transition in terms of a broad socioeconomic picture. I am thinking about people in, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa that are relying on diesel generators so that they have power, for operating rooms or for wells so that they can have access to clean water. I am not just thinking about middle class individuals in Houston, Texas, where I live now, who are potentially able to spend more money on cleaner energy sources. There are many communities within our own backyard in America that have a very difficult time choosing between paying their energy bills and paying their food and paying their rent. And this is a broad geopolitical force and problem that we're going to have to solve. And so for me, it isn't just about the climate, or it isn't just about energy rights and energy poverty as a whole. It's about trying to be a voice towards solving many of those nuanced, complicated problems.
Excellent. Well, Liz, it was a joy to have you on the podcast today.
This was a really great conversation. If anyone wants to connect, feel free to follow Endolith or Synvita on LinkedIn, and to absolutely connect with me on LinkedIn as well.
Well, you heard Liz. I'll put the links below in the description box as well for Endolith and Synvita and your LinkedIn and all the things. This is Yoga Shri Pradhan, and we're signing off.